I've been called this director a few times. I'm like, I've been called so much worse. I mean, as long as you're not calling me late to dinner or for a drink or for, something that I'm expecting to be I was just going to start the presentation for Gavin's
Hello, hello, hello.
I was confused.
That's all that matters.
John
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Cody Rose, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Foundation. Good evening, and welcome to A Journey Through Time, the library's 123-year legacy. Tonight, we're honored to have Kevin Koistra, Executive Director of the Western Heritage Center, speak about our library's 123-year history. With his extensive experience in history, archaeology, and anthropology, Kevin brings a deep understanding of Montana's cultural heritage. His work has significantly contributed to preserving and sharing our community's stories. Let's warmly welcome Kevin as he takes us through the endearing legacy of our beloved library.
Thank you, Cody. I appreciate the invitation and to see so many friends in the audience. How nice is that? I find that actually a little intimidating. It's almost easier with 400 strangers than to look everywhere and know somebody, but we're gonna wing it then. So anyway, I'm going to talk about the history of the public libraries, obviously, and focus. I have a lot on the first building, the Parmley Billings Memorial Library building. And I actually had really fun. I'd done a program similar to this maybe, 10 years ago maybe. And I spent several hours going back, looking at the research, finding new research, and I think I found some really, really fun stuff to share tonight. So, and I even have my alarm set. So if I start buzzing at 38 minutes, you'll know why. All right, so let's just get into this. I assume that people don't know anything about Billings, so I'm going to start right at the beginning. Billings was established in 1882 by the Northern Pacific Railway, one of the three transcontinental railroads that crossed the United States. The Northern Pacific here, the Union Pacific in the central part of this country, and the Southern Pacific in the southern. And you can see in this picture, Billings in its fledgling days in the summer of 1882, the town of Coulson, which would pretty quickly disappear. They made the mistake of naming their town after the steamboat company. Billings was named for the railroad president. So the first mentions I see of a library come out of newspapers in the state of Montana. In 1886 and 87, there were notices in the Livingston Enterprise and the Great Falls Tribune about Billings residents purchasing books to start a library. The Livingston paper said H.H. Mund donated a space in the bank and purchased 125 books for the library. The Great Falls Tribune noted that books were scattered all around the city of Billings. These early libraries were often set in bank, which is a great space. They have a kind of cavernous feeling and things like that. but we're going to get into the 1890s. 1880s was a tough time in Billings. It was not clear how well we were going to thrive, even though we were named for the Northern Pacific Railroad president, Frederick Billings. It wasn't until the 1890s when the civic capitalists who settled into Billings and said, you know what, this town is going to thrive, we're going to do well. And in the 1890s, then there's a discussion of a more permanent library. So this, I wanted to share a little about Frederick Billings, our town's namesake. Of course, our library would be called the Parmley Billings Memorial Library. And that's a little confusing because a lot of people used to say the Billings Parmley Library or Parmley, would go back and forth. And the reason is because it's two last names. Frederick Billings fell in love with Julia Parmley, a New York socialite. And what's really fun about that story is Frederick was a bachelor in his mid-30s and was concerned that he might never get married. He met this wonderful New York socialite who was actually at an event a suitor had put on. And the suitor basically was going to propose to her, and she said she had met someone else that night. And what's really fun is that I had access to all the letters and diaries from this marriage in 1862. I know what they did on their honeymoon. They read Longfellow, the story of Priscilla, Priscilla and the love interest of, the book is escaping my mind right now. Come on, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Oh, I'll get back to it, I'm sorry. So anyway, they would read to each other. That's all I know from the diaries. So this is what Frederick Billings said at a speech that he gave at the dedication of the Norman Williams Library in Woodstock, Vermont. It was a library that was needed. Nothing could be so useful. Who can forecast the abiding, uplifting, and far-reaching influences and the opportunities and benefits of such a gift? So Frederick Billings early on really suited himself to helping support libraries in the places that he was at in Vermont. Of course, he will have instrumental in terms of the development of our libraries here. So Frederick Billings actually purchased the private library collections of George Perkins Marsh, the early conservationist, who happened to live in the biggest house in Woodstock, Vermont, which Frederick Billings would then purchase and live in. Marsh was a noted statesman, conservationist. Billings felt it was really important to protect the works of Marsh, so he was going to build a library for him. So he hired the preeminent architect of the time period, Henry Hobson Richardson, who built these beautiful Romanesque sandstone structures with uneven towers, deep-set windows, and arched doorways. Looks a little familiar, doesn't it? This building still exists. It's at the University of Vermont campus in Burlington. It is now the Student Union building. So again, the Billings family, that Frederick gave his name to this town, but he never lived here. He sent his eldest child, Parmley Billings, is the mother's maiden name, and his bachelor name, Parmley Billings, would live here in Billings for about 4 years. And he wrote 70 letters back to Woodstock, Vermont, all disparaging of Billings. I actually love his wicked sense of humor and some of them. He'd write for like 11 pages, and I remember one line is, "Prospects in Billings look as bright as the bottom of a camp frying pan." But the Billings family, Frederick Billings and their estate, were supporters of the first Congregational Church, the first schools here in Billings, and the founding of the local YMCA. So they provided funds, which makes sense. If you're a wealthy capitalist and the town is named after you, you would hope that you would get some support that way, right? He helped us in some ways establish the Hesper Farm, which was on the west end of town, which was the beginning of our agriculture and irrigation here in Billings, critical to the early growth as a railroad town to have that foundational aspect of irrigation. And as I mentioned, Parmley lived here off and on for about 4 years to kind of look over his father's holdings and things like that, start the second bank, the Billings and Billings Bank. But unfortunately, at the age of 35, the handsome gentleman, Parmley Billings, died on a return trip back to Woodstock. So he died of uremic poisoning, which was an illness stemming from his childhood. And that is in 1888 that happened. So all over the state of Montana, plans were being made to expand and build libraries. Especially, this is from 1889. The cities of Butte, Dillon, Helena, and Missoula had a tax mill to support their libraries by the year 1899. According to the Butte Miner, in February of 1899, Billings, Livingston, and other towns were now agitating toward building public libraries. Again, that foundational aspect of the town finally settling in, looking like it has great prospects for a future. The library often is that first big building. The library at Great Falls was made possible by a donation by Mrs. Paris Gibson. The Hearst Free Library at Anaconda was one of the two largest in the state at the time. So after a stop and start years of the 1880s and early 1890s, Billings stabilized and led a group of civic-minded citizens for plans for making a new public library. The bids were built for building the new library were used the plans of Charles S. Hare were submitted on September 11, 1899. So Hare's plan was forwarded and then approved by Frederick Billings Jr. Frederick Billings had already passed in 1890, so now you're talking about Parmley Billings' brother, Frederick Billings Jr., approved the plans that were designed by Charles S. Hare. And I love this. This is a Charles S. Hare building also in Dillon, which obviously looks pretty similar too, doesn't it? So he was doing that same fashioning of what's called the Richardsonian Romanesque style. The library in Dillon is actually a Carnegie library, where in Billings it would be supported by the Billings family. So Frederick Billings Jr. paid for the construction of the Parmley Billings Memorial Library, named for his brother. It would be built close to the railroad depot, which at this time was on the same side of the tracks on North Broadway. So if you went down North Broadway, you'd get stopped by the depot. So they wanted to build this new library close to the depot, so when people came in 1901, even if they were just passing through Billings, passing the depot or something, they would see this grand library on the side of the tracks. The Gazette, Billings Gazette published this piece of wisdom. There will now be at least one place in town where young men can spend an evening without hanging around a saloon. And one really important thing about this building, everything until this time period, Minnesota and Montana avenues were named for the Montana and Minnesota Land Improvement Company, a railroad subsidiary. So in the 1880s, that block on both sides did not have really any buildings there. So all of the street front on Montana Avenue faced 300 feet to Minnesota Ave. So everything was the railroad. This building is built in 1901 with its back to the tracks. And after this point in time, from 1900 to 1920, we would rename North 28th North Broadway and focus the development of downtown in that direction. So when the new library was open, the citizens of Billings made it a holiday. The businesses closed, schools were dismissed, and everybody who could flocked to the Opera House on Montana Avenue to take part in the joyous event. And you can see, I'll talk about these additions, but this is the original library in 1901. That central, it looks almost identical in some ways to the Dillon Library that Charles S. Hare was developing. So on Tuesday, October 1st, 1901, will, as the paper said, will long be remembered in Billings as a red letter day. And now, looking to the future of our growing city, this day's deeds mark a new epoch in the history for all time to come. It has made Billings a better place to live. So the Billings family provided the funds, obviously, to build this new library. And Julia Parmley Billings, Frederick Sr.'s wife, basically donated this plaque. So this plaque is actually in the hallway when you first enter the Western Heritage Center today. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. So it's a Bible quote from Philippians. And then the list on the library plaque has most of the major civic leaders of Billings at the time, including Albert Babcock, J.D. Matheson, I.D. O'Donnell, E.L. Boardman, and Judge Goss. Almost immediately, Billings continued to grow from 1900 to 1910. Our population almost tripled. We became kind of the transportation center of the Yellowstone River, the largest town in the Yellowstone River Valley. And so there was a calling to expand it almost within the first decade. So librarian Mabel Collins met with Julia Parmley Billings and her son, Frederick Billings Jr., in New York City in July of 1910. Miss Collins from Billings visited and inspected libraries in Boston, New York, and other eastern cities before going to lunch with Frederick Billings Jr. and Julia in New York City. Mabel Collins discussed the needs of the Billings Public Library, especially the need for a children's room, and also delivered a letter from I.D. O'Donnell, a longtime family friend. At the table, this is great, I love fundraising, right? So she's sitting there with the Billings and she says, we really have some needs. We need a children's library. The city is growing, there's a need. The Billings offered $5,000 at the lunch, which is equal to about $162,000 today. Just to get things moving. And within a month or so, Frederick Billings Jr. would actually give the city $7,500 to build the expansion, what's the east wing of the library, about $242,000. Mabel had job security for 5 years. I don't. So there was an announcement again, the Billings population continued to grow. And again, the demands on the public to expand the library and to offer new services happened in the early 1920s. An announcement in May of 1923 for funding the West Wing Library Edition, saying the library was once a place for just storing books. Librarian Mrs. Henry Garber, also known as Elizabeth Abbott, and others noted that the library had now become a community center. And others noted the library had become a meeting ground for the women's clubs, church groups, the Farm Bureau, the Liberal Club, the Beekeepers Association, and many others. It had become a research center for businessmen, medical professionals, and students. It had become a place for children from Billings and also rural Montana to access reading and storytelling programs and art classes, and as a location for the growing museum collection for the city. So in the building itself, and Miss Elizabeth Billings supported the funding in this round in 1923 in honor of her two brothers now, Frederick Billings Jr. and Parmley Billings in the screen there. If you're familiar with the building, the Western Heritage Center there's the glass partition. That west wing was reserved as the study area or the quiet area for everybody to go in. And the downstairs was slowly becoming basically a town museum. And it makes sense, 1882, you're about 40 years in, you're getting nostalgic, you're collecting things, and I'll talk about that in a second here. So at the dedication, Senator Henry Myers of Montana said, in the upbuilding of a free, governing, self-governing nation, the chief factors are literature, the press, the schools, and churches. These are the four stones on which our free civilization rests. Our freedom from the ills which have overcome other nations is largely due to the enlightenment of our own people. As I mentioned, in 1923, it was determined that the lower floor of the West Wing would become the museum room. So in 1927, for example, a large display of birds, seashells, antique guns, a mounted butterfly display, the Josephine steamer bell, a pair of beaver, petrified wood, L.A. Huffman, photographs, bones of prehistoric creatures, and many rare books became part of the collections of the library. I don't think they had a collections policy at that point. And it's interesting too, because like these scissors, they have a long history, and then like the gentleman over here in the lower right, Horace Bivens, donated his seashell collection from when he was in the Philippine-American conflict. Some of these things are still around, they're still here. But I did find, I think it's pretty cool, is that a lot of the museums or repositories of history in our community actually have a lot of the stuff that was in the libraries in the late 20s and 1930s. These are 3 examples. You know, the bird specimens up at the science room, up at the MSU Billings, those actually were part of the library collection. So you could see all these bird mounts. They look a little worn after, 100 years, but we still borrow them, as I'm doing in this particular photo. When the Yellowstone County Museum was developed in the 1950s, they now have the Josephine steamboat bell, and the Western Heritage Center actually has the Plentycoo's life mask that used to be in the library. So it's pretty neat how, the library took on this new role and eventually discovered, well, maybe we're not the best suited to be a full-time museum, so they started dispersing these materials. And what I love is that we've many times displayed the Plentycoo's life mask, as well as some crow dolls that were in the library collection in the same building in the West Gallery. So it's like they returned back at some point when the Western Heritage Center was created in the 1970s. I mentioned Mabel Collins getting all that funding, Margaret Fulmer or Mrs. Garber and her work in securing the finance for the 1923 edition. The library, the librarians, educated women who often were apprenticed under other head librarian, managed the staff, worked with the library board and trustees, ordered books, gave presentations in the community on a variety of topics, and sought public support and funding. So the first 70 years, first plus 70 years, the museum or the library was actually run by women. Bob Cookingham became the first male director in 1974. So there's some fantastic photos in the collections here at the library, and I'm going to share some of these. Library circulation, population growth continued to increase in the 1950s and 1960s. Again, there was this calling about a need to expand. It's been this ever-present thing. Because Billings has something unique about it, is that it always had steady growth. It wasn't like Bozeman that went kind of quiet for a long period of time and then came back. Billings has always had substantial growth through its history. In 1960, 17,000 Billings residents were regular users of the library, representing 1/3 of the city's population. And this is, of course, what's fun about this is I can see pictures in this, the gallery here, that we still actually have in our collections today. So as I mentioned, pressure mounted in the 1940s and 50s to expand library services, address the lack of parking, and to reconsider the location that was stuck along the railroad tracks. The building was built in 1901, so it didn't really address the automobile age. So even for us as a museum today, we still have to kind of deal with that aspect of where we are on Montana Avenue. So this is a photo in the downstairs basement. Apparently they just couldn't fit anybody, so there are kids sitting outside the windows, it looks like. They look like a little scary to me, actually. And what I love about these photos from the 50s and 60s is like they're incorporating new technologies. The Friends of the Billings Public Library are organized to provide fundraising for support of the library in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This is the use of new technology. Sound storytelling. And again, expanding on that idea of access for collections here. The first bookmobiles were purchased in the 1950s. And a temporary branch library was also established in Billings. Again, the needs of the community were always outpacing what the library could provide. So this is interesting. In the 1960s, they finally made their move, and there was some debate over this. And of course, if you are not aware, the library would be fit into the old Billings Hardware Company warehouse, which was right over here in the parking lot. But actually, what I love is Mayor Willard Frazier, along with Vernon Drake, the architect, really pushed the idea of moving Cobb Field and the baseball field from the downtown to the west end, out where Stewart Park was. And what they wanted to do was build a brand new library in the 1960s that would take up the whole block where Cobb Field is today, or Dealer Park is today. That suggestion did not go over well. And it seemed like everything you read about Willard Frazier was like, well, it's not a bad idea doing the warehouse, but and it seemed actually almost like a good idea, doesn't it? We think about it now, and we realize moving the baseball field to the west end maybe alleviate a little bit of the downtown traffic, but what?
Disagree.
You disagree? Oh, good. I knew some architect in town would be. No, it was Vern Drake. So I know. The Board of Trustees and Director Hake decided to purchase the old Billings Hardware building at 510 North Broadway and renovate it. Mayor Willard Frazier again condemned the move by saying the new building was not beautiful enough. But actually what's fun is that Vernon Drake then would be instrumental in saving the old library on Montana Avenue. Vernon Drake was the founder in some ways of the Western Heritage Center by saving the building. So Mayor Frazier goes on and says, I've always been pro-library, but he preferred the new site and the new building, but he said, I'm ready to accept the inevitable. And so moving out of the old library on Montana Avenue to the new larger facility here right next door at North Broadway, they had a library sale in 1969. To sell off, stereoscopes right there and things like that. There's this story I always used to hear at the library, the building we're in, at the Western Heritage Center about an old stuffed polar bear. Anybody want to age themselves right now? Do you remember the old stuffed polar bear? Apparently it was pretty ratty by the 1969, so we did not save that. And then kind of one of the coolest features of that new library, of course, was the spiral staircase. People feel at home in the library because there's plenty of open space and light. It's a cheerful atmosphere. Miss Lynn said because it was so crowded, the old library was slightly oppressive. So it really did. It obviously provided parking, it provided more space, and expanding its programming. And again, introductions of new technologies is always interesting. There was a lot of fanfare over the, I don't know how you say this, the Regiscope to check out materials. It looks way more sophisticated than I could manage, I think. And again, expanding the services to include listening to records became a thing. And reading by sound. So I love the idea that they're incorporating new technologies as they come up. And even the Western Heritage Center, when we were founded, Vernon Drake said, we should incorporate new technologies. And what he had in mind was he saw a documentary on TV at the World's Fair. So, and it's actually in our 1971 description of how we would incorporate new technologies. So I love that. He had some insight in the future, too. So microfiche and microfilm viewers in the Montana Room collections. If you're not familiar with a microfilm reader, it's a device used for projecting and magnifying images stored in microform, such as newspapers and documents, to readable proportions. You still have them here?
Yes.
You do? Okay. It's funny, there's an architect in town, Ed knows, so I can't say her name. She came to the museum one day and said, I said, what have you been up to? And she said, for the last 2.5 days, I've been doing microfilm over at the public library to search for some property records. And I said, really? I said, what are the name of the properties? I said, what are the name of the properties? And I went on newspapers.com and I found all the articles she found in less than 10 minutes. She put her head in her hands and went, oh, don't tell anybody my name. That was like 4 years ago or so. Again, pressure builds to expand library services into the 1990s. This little stuffed bear, you remember this in the children's area? Kind of reminds me of the polar bear from the 60s. It was getting pretty beat up by this point. I don't believe that was saved, was it? No. You want me to go without sound? I come from New Jersey. We're loud talkers. Anyway, Bill Cochran takes over as the library. I put a question mark. 40th birthday, I have no idea. And of course, the services are moving forward. The Library Foundation, under the guidance of Leslie Mondrau, and maybe you could tell the story better, is that Will Bruder was hired by somebody with a $2 million donation to draw plans. So the plans were drawn, and then it was a matter of fundraising and getting people in Billings interested in moving forward on a state-of-the-art library. So Will Bruder, famed architect for a lot of Western libraries, in particular in Arizona. I think there's like 7 or 8 in the Phoenix area. He has libraries that he was the designer for Nevada, California, Colorado, and now Montana. Leslie could do a whole program on the fundraising aspect. Quite an effort, incredible. So, and the idea, of course, is the campaign would come to fruit, hit the streets, and the Billings voters on November 8th, 2011, Billings will have a new library by a margin of nearly 57 to 43%. Billings voters approved a $16 million bond to build a new public library. Part of that effort was also to do tours while the library was being built. I almost forgot this too, that the libraries were actually side by side. So they were side by side during this tour in 2013 with Don Olson, taking people from the community into the new library as it was being built. There's a picture of that tour in 2013, kind of describing where it was going. Will Bruder designed the library to be sustainable, transparent, and a dynamic community gathering place. One project that we got involved with before the old library was torn down was myself and Joyce Jensen, Dr. Jane Weaver, who's from the Frick Museum, the historian Elizabeth Grenier, and Tracy Livingston. We got to go through a lot of the Montana Room materials and identify 200 documents that would then be available on the Montana portal. And it was so exciting to have 5 geeks looking at all of this amazing collection. One of the pieces I should mention too, like you can see this, the women's opposition group to suffrage. So I never saw any of those materials. They were from 1914. They set up across the street from Jeanette Rankin and her group who were fighting for suffrage. So those pamphlets, but one of the coolest things we found was a 1943 mimeograph sheet, 40 pages of conditions at the Hart Mountain relocation camp in Wyoming. So it was talking about the Japanese relocation camp. I looked at books on history of Hart Mountain. I never saw that document reference. It's now available on the Montana History portal. And then here, for a short time, the 2 buildings were side by side. Not very long, I don't know, maybe 3 months or so. Like the library was almost getting ready to open. And it took a little while. I remember for the demolition, I can't remember, there was some environmental issues. It delayed, and this is the, I love my job is awesome. Anytime I hear there's a demolition in town, I get my camera, so. So this is the demolition in May of 19 2014. And then Bill Cochran retired. They say you only have one capital campaign in your lifetime. Apparently that pushed Bill out the door. And Billings Public Library candidate in this photo, a Billings Gazette photo, Gavin Wolter, during the library's meet and greet on June 22nd. In 2016, he was named the candidate to replace retired director Bill Cochran, who began his job in August of 2016. So my last slide here, the buzzer's going to go off in a second. I just listed some of the things that the library does today. I love the idea that in the 1920s, people recognized the need that the library had become a community center. So we needed to expand, and in some ways it continues, it is still taking that same role. So these are, I'm sure there's a lot more going on, but this is what I got. Community events, useful information, public programs, access to technology, displays, children's area, community archive, classes, audio, outreach, book study areas, Spanish story time, on and on, a neighborhood gathering place, which is almost similar to what they were doing in the 1920s when they did that third expansion. It continues to be a place where people gather, and it's not a place where they just store old books. It hasn't been that way for 100 years. So anyway, and that's what I have. Thank you. Longfellow is the Miles Standish story. That's the story they read to each other on their honeymoon. And if you've ever read it, it is a fantastically romantic book. So, anyway. So thank you so much. Anybody have any questions?
The front steps on the now the Western Heritage Center, they're different from what was pictured in the original one. Do you see any photos that where it's evident that happened?
It happened in the early 1990s. So as we moved in as the museum in the 1990s, a community effort was not only to repair the steps and make them more accessible, but also to move the Frederick Billings statue from the parking area on North 27th over to where it is today.
Did the Billings family, any member of the Billings family besides Parmley, when this library opened, did they ever come to Billings?
Yeah, Frederick Billings came in 1883, and he did actually a speech on the headquarters hotel, which was actually the Bermuda in town, and his speech is really weird. He's like, I don't know why you named this town after me, I have nothing to do with it. Everything he said in the speech was like a fabrication. But then at the end he says, but I do know one thing. It's quite a story. He says, if anybody wanted to make some money, they should invest in the coal mines in the Bull Mountains. Frederick Billings was the primary landholder. So I don't know if he was doing a wink and like kidding with everybody in the audience, but Henry Villard and all the German investors who had taken over the Northern Pacific at that point were standing behind him. And I don't know if he was trying to get them engaged in particularly investing in the Bull Mountain coal that he controlled. But the speech is a very odd, you don't know if he's being cynical, because he was there at every step. The naming, he said, I can't be an owner because I don't own any land. He actually owned a lot of land. He actually, even Benjamin Stewart, the minister from the Congregational Church, he actually set up to start buying land for him, because he knew that if people found Frederick Billings was the owner or buying land, the prices would go up. So he paid for the Congregational Church, and he had the Congregational minister be his land agent. Things you have to do for the Lord. Right? Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Please stick around and feel free to chat. And thank you so much for coming out.